No illness should be attached to shame, yet those living with schizophrenia and their families bear much of the shame that others associate with having a mental illness, and undeservedly so. Together, let's stop contributing to the spread of shame by learning the facts about schizophrenia. Next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. If you're diagnosed with cancer, you access good treatment and you get love and support. But if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia, you may be reluctant to access care, some because of the illness itself, which we'll talk a little bit about later, and some because of what it means to actually have the illness. Because if you're living with schizophrenia, instead of support, what people and their families often experience is the stigma associated with this mental illness. Tonight we're talking about schizophrenia so that we can have a greater understanding of this illness and take some steps forward to create a kinder, gentler community of support for all of us. A step you can take tonight is to call in your questions, because if you think about it, you're probably not the only person who has the question that you would be calling in. So you're doing the community a favor, not just yourself a favor. Call right now locally, dial 218-788-2844, or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. My guests tonight are Dr. John Glick, a staff psychiatrist at the Human Development Center, who's board certified in adult psychiatry, and Linda Kern, the St. Louis County Social Service Supervisor of Adult Mental Health and Adult Protective Services. Thanks so much to both of you for being here tonight. And let's just get started right away. Dr. Glick, let's start with a description for our viewing audience of what schizophrenia is.
It's hard to do that real succinctly. I would call it usually a chronic illness that often comes on slowly and often comes on in the teens and 20s, and it's associated with a certain set of typical symptoms, including hallucinations and paranoia, disorganization of speech and behavior, and then withdrawal and isolation is often a part too. And it's often a disabling illness that leads to decreased functioning socially and occupationally.
And you talked a little bit about how the illness comes on slowly. And what would people likely be experiencing in sort of that early pre-diagnosis phase?
You mean the family or the person themselves?
The person themselves.
Oh, I would think, some depression and anxiety wouldn't be uncommon, social discomfort, some paranoia that's maybe not gotten to a bizarre or real intense level, but generally, feeling like people are maybe somewhat against you, and maybe some trouble concentrating and thinking clearly too.
And Linda, what do you know? Tell us about your experiences about what families first notice.
Well, and families, their whole world burns before their very eyes as they know it. So it is totally new ground for them to look at and cover. And I loved your introduction, because I think that often in 1999, the Supreme Court made the Olmstead decision, which said it's illegal for persons with disabilities to be segregated. And I think we do that in our mental health system right now, in our mental illness. And I think that we want to lock the person up, or the family doesn't know what to do. And I think instead of treating the whole person and looking at that full human being as, what's, like you said in your introduction, it was wonderful. Like if it was stage 4 cancer, you'd go in, they wouldn't say, well, come back when it's stage 5 or 6, which is what we do sometimes with families or people. We would treat it, and we would honor that person in there and what they're going through. It's a scary time for families.
I think part of this, and we'll just go there right now. I was going to go there a little later, but we'll just go there right now. And part of it is that families often feel helpless because often when a person gets diagnosed, they may already be in that young adult phase. And Linda, you know, I know that families are often, you know, they know that their person needs help, but the person themselves may not feel like they need help. And it's like, well, can't we make people get help? Why can't we make people get the help that they need? Because their heart is in the right place.
Right. Well, no one wants to have diabetes or schizophrenia or anything, and I think that there's some denial that goes with it, and you don't understand it, or you start putting some drugs or alcohol on board to try to even it out. And I think it's very complex. So I think we lose the person in it sometimes.
And talk a little bit, Dr. Glick, just about how some of that, because some of a part of the illness can be to have also a lack of insight and awareness about being ill, at least in the beginning of that. And talk a little bit about how that can be part of the illness and also part of any time we get diagnosed with something big in our life.
Well, for sure, with schizophrenia, lack of illness is very typical, and it's really often considered a part of the illness, and it's not just a coping mechanism. It's almost like a neurological lack of awareness. We've all heard stories of people who have a stroke and they forget about half their body. People with schizophrenia often, because of this lack of insight, don't believe they're ill. And then, of course, that lack of insight is associated with difficulty at taking medications regularly. But you know, so there's something specific in schizophrenia that's probably neurologically part of the illness that's a little different than with a lot of illnesses. But in general, yeah, it's hard to accept that you have an illness, because to do that you have to go into the patient role, and especially probably for men, but for anybody that's hard to do.
I think, though, what you said was so important when you were describing that this lack of insight is really a neurological phenomenon in people with schizophrenia, because I think some people and maybe family members think it's the person being willful or being stubborn about getting help, when really it's like, oh gosh, no, that's actually a symptom of the illness itself. And that's such an educational point to know, because then, you know, we get frustrated when people won't do what could be the helpful thing. But if you understand more that it's just a part of that is a symptom of the illness, that might help people just sort of manage their own frustrations and respond in maybe more of a loving and kind way with that. Talk a little bit about the treatment for schizophrenia, Dr. Glick.
Well, I think most people are familiar with antipsychotic medications, and that's an important central part of the treatment. To educate the individual and the family about the illness is critical with any illness, including schizophrenia. More and more, we do provide cognitive behavioral psychotherapy along with the medication treatment, and quick example of that would be just helping people to understand that the voices are coming from their own brain and not from somebody else's mind. And if you can realize that the voices are coming from your own brain, you can do something about it. Then you can start looking at what's making my voices worse, what might make them better. Whereas if they're coming from outside of you, you're helpless and you can't really influence them. But you have to obviously have a certain amount of insight to be able to do some of that cognitive behavioral therapy.
And so I think one of the questions that people would have then is medication always a part of treatment for schizophrenia?
Well, I think for the most part, the answer would be yes. You know, to diagnose schizophrenia, you have to have been ill for 6 months. And if somebody's had their first episode, typical treatment is to continue antipsychotics for a minimum of 1 to 2 years. Unless, let's say, it was such a bad episode that the person almost killed themselves, you might decide you want to never go off medications. If you've had a second episode, though, I think then most psychiatrists would recommend at that point long-term treatment with antipsychotics. And there definitely is an advantage to getting the medication started earlier rather than later. The studies do show that people that take their medications and stay on them early on do better in terms of, job functioning and social functioning.
And that brings us to like a really good point, Linda, that I'd like you to talk a little bit about, is that I think a lot of people have an image of people with schizophrenia, and often because this is how it's portrayed. It's portrayed in the media that people with schizophrenia are odd or strange. Words like deranged are used.
Dangerous, right?
Dangerous. We'll talk about dangerous in a second.
Yep.
But the other part about is that that schizophrenia is such a debilitating illness that, number one, a person with schizophrenia couldn't possibly work. So
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think sometimes we have criminalized people with mental illness because we don't know what else to do with them, and we can't hospitalize or lock people up. We don't have state hospitals anymore. People will say, "I wish we still had them," but that's not the answer either. I was thinking when you talked about medicine too. I think there are lots of medicines, and in the Native American culture, everything is medicine. So medicine is the relationship you have with your family, with the people that you're working with, the assertive community treatment team that you are part of with the psychiatry. Your work, meaningful work, is good medicine. I could ask you that, and you know that. So I think what we do sometimes is, again, we take people and we say, well, they have mental illness and they're over here, but they're human beings, full human beings. We can't forget that they want relationships. They want a safe place to live. They want a healthy life. Maybe they want to take violin lessons. Maybe they want to learn how to drive a car. I think it's so important that we don't just see the person through the eyes of the mental illness and the diagnosis, that we look at the whole person with compassion and what are your dreams and aspirations for your life. And sometimes by the time it all comes undone, the family is so burned out and having such a hard time that those relationships are really hard and challenging.
And Linda mentioned the assertive community treatment team. Tell us a little bit about that. So, the three of us know what that means, but a lot of people out there don't know what that means. And talk a little bit about the ACT team and what that is and what that does.
So, ACT, assertive community treatment, is a treatment for individuals with chronic psychosis and schizophrenia. I think the vital ingredients is that it's a multidisciplinary team. There's specialists from lots of different fields, employment specialists, chemical dependency, psychiatry, nursing, social work, and they all collaborate and get together and coordinate the care, which is really critical. And they go out into the community and provide a lot of the service in the community if that's what's needed.
It's really a wraparound service, kind of a hospital without walls almost, that we give whatever support is needed, right? So if they need medicine every day maybe to get back on their feet, that's what would happen. If they need a job for part of their recovery, then that's whatever is needed.
I think originally, it developed because people are observing the revolving door. You go into the hospital, you have everything. You get discharged, there's very little available. And so the idea was, like Linda said, let's bring the services, let's bring the hospital to the patient in the community. So
I love that description of it being the hospital without walls.
Yeah, two assertive community treatment teams in Duluth. And
that whole notion of, if you think about that, when you have this significant illness, and what we know is going to help is sort of the consistency of the care and people being able to helping people to learn how to take their medications every day. Going out into the community is the answer, instead of expecting really ill people to find their way to your office in the beginning. And that just gives such the helping hand to elevate people to fulfill what their own purpose in life is then. Here's a question, Dr. Glick. Can taking illegal drugs in adolescence lead to schizophrenia?
Well, I think that what the studies are showing is that if you use cannabis regularly, you increase your risk of developing schizophrenia 3 to 4 times over what it would be without. But the thinking is that it's not the cannabis alone that's usually enough, that the cannabis, maybe along with the vulnerability, is what leads to the schizophrenia. But it definitely does increase the risk for a population of people if they're using cannabis.
And along the same lines, is schizophrenia an inherited disease?
There's definitely a genetic vulnerability. Current thinking about genetic vulnerability is that there's many different individual genes, and you inherit multiple risk genes, and those risk genes don't just put you at risk for schizophrenia, but also for bipolar disorder and severe depression.
And we also know that if you have a first-degree family member with schizophrenia, that increases your risk of developing schizophrenia as well. Am I right about that, wrong about that?
Well, with parents, for sure. One
Yep.
parent, 12% risk for offspring. Although, majority of folks with schizophrenia don't have family histories.
Let's move now to talking about, I think, like one of what the media often portrays, and when we hear the most about people with schizophrenia, is when there has been just a horrific event. In general, mental illness is always raised, and often sometimes because the person does have mental illness. But then what makes me shiver is that people draw conclusions about what that means then. And so, Linda, talk a little bit about the notion that people with schizophrenia are more dangerous than people who don't have schizophrenia.
Well, and so it's not true. And of course, we can't predict human behavior. So sometimes we don't know, but we can't lock people up for what they might do, or if they're having hallucinations or something that's happening that scare us a little bit. We don't get to say, well, we don't get to lock people, or we'd all be locked up. We don't get to lock people up for what they might do. So that's not how we look at it, I guess, as I would say. Would you concur?
Yeah. Well, first of all, somebody with schizophrenia is much more likely to be a victim of violence
Right.
than to
Yeah.
Perpetrate violence.
I think that's
Yeah.
a really important point
That's
that
really
just sort of
important.
deserves a little pause for
Yeah.
us to reflect upon that, and because that gets at the I think the vulnerability of the person, but also some of the stigma that's attached to mental illness. So number one, people with schizophrenia are more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence. And
Well, if you have a significant alcohol use disorder, alcohol dependence, you're probably 2 times more likely to be aggressive or violent than somebody with schizophrenia. So you got to put it in perspective. There certainly is violence in the context of schizophrenia, and the risk factors that predict that are when the mental illness hasn't been treated, and when there's a substance abuse issue associated with the schizophrenia, and when the individual has a history of impulsiveness or a past history of violence. But if people can be treated, both the chemical dependency and schizophrenia, the risk is pretty low.
And one of the studies that I read in just preparing for this show, they took a look at people with schizophrenia who had a childhood history of conduct problems and those who did not. And the people who had a childhood history of conduct problems were the people who were more likely to be aggressive. And so it raised the whole issue of chicken and egg there and what was really responsible. And I think that once a person's diagnosed with schizophrenia, that's the easy hook to hang the hat on. When it's not necessary, it may not be sort of the causative agent behind the aggressive behavior. And I think it's just important to say that the fact that somebody has hallucinations are not always about being dangerous either.
Right.
Sometimes very creative. I mean, it's a creative spirit. It can be have some positive connotations also.
Right, and where I certainly have encountered people who felt like they were being visited by good spirits or good witches that helped them in the world and gave them a sense of safety and protection, and that's much different than what we see on TV then, and how things are portrayed.
And yet it's it's a disease that people suffer with too. Sometimes I think I work at the county building. Sometimes I think the courage it takes for a person even to get out of bed, put one foot in front of the other, come to stand in line to get, a check, or it just takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, and a lot of the suffering comes from the hallucinations
Right.
and delusional thinking, paranoia, but also from the so-called deficit or negative symptoms, which is a lack of motivation and sometimes lack of feeling a lot of positive emotion. Those are called negative symptoms, and a lot of the suffering comes from that as well.
Lack of relationships,
lack
Loneliness.
of relationships, and again, also they have a lack of not being able to anticipate joyful experiences. Where we can anticipate, if I do this thing, it will make me feel good. They have to be doing it in order to feel good, because this inability to anticipate that. And I think
most recent research shows, I don't know how they figure these things out, but people with schizophrenia enjoy themselves as much as the next person, but then they forget how much fun they had.
Yeah.
So you have to remind them as a way to motivate them to get back at it.
Here's a question, Dr. Glick. What's the youngest age schizophrenia can present itself?
Well, like any other mental illness, it does occur in childhood. I don't know what the history would be in terms of the lowest, but for the most part, it's late teens and into the 20s. Tends to be a little earlier with males and a little later with women.
At the TAC program, the Transitional Assertive Community Treatment Team, so we see that often they go to college their freshman year, all of a sudden life unfolds, and they start having their first symptoms.
And we know that the high risk age is often, I think, in men between 16 and 27, and college is smack dab in the middle of that. And going away, and if you're going away to college, you have, that's a whole new world, a change in sometimes often a lack of that, you've left your support system that you did have, and you're going into this strange new world, which is a real stress on anybody's system, much less somebody who may be predisposed to developing schizophrenia. Here's a question, I kind of like this one. If someone talks to themselves repeatedly during stressful situations, is that schizophrenia? From Duluth. I think it's a great question, and I also, it's like, I think like sometimes not, because I know I do that, right? But they're getting at this idea of, it is true that we will see some people with schizophrenia who are talking to themselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the typical scenario there is somebody's rambling down the street, not paying attention to what's going on around them, absorbed internally and carrying on a conversation.
Right.
I think it's actually kind of not that common to talk to yourself when you have schizophrenia, and by itself it would mean absolutely nothing in terms of being at risk for schizophrenia.
Yeah, I think, which is a really good point, that the fact that you do one thing or that you have one thing that looks similar does not mean that you have an does not mean that you have an illness per se. What do we want to say about the resources for families that exist out there, Linda?
So there are a lot of resources in Duluth. We're pretty rich. So the crisis response team will respond to families and children, and it's hard. There are the Amber Wing. I mean, we are working with HDC to respond to a first episode psychosis grant that would be amazing for really supportive of families who are going through this, because they need a lot of support to secure their relationships.
And we're running out of time, and so I'm going to conclude with my last question, which is, what is your message of hope for our viewing audience?
So my message of hope is that the Duluth community is really doing amazing things right now. We have an embedded social worker with the police department. The police are amazing, the Duluth police. They're getting trained in how to de-escalate people with mental illness, work with people. What's changed is this was said by a cop to me, we used to throw them on the ground, cuff them, and put them in jail, and now we talk to them for an hour. We get to know them, and I think that's a good lesson for all of us, to talk, slow down, truly hear the human being in there, not just the diagnosis.
Truly hear the human being in there. So one human being that I would really like you to check out is Cecilia McGow. She did a TEDx talk, and she is a college student at Penn State University who majors in astronomy and astrophysics. Her TED Talk is about her lived experience with schizophrenia because she was bound and determined to put a face on schizophrenia that is myth-busting and destigmatizing for others out there. Her TED Talk is called I Am Not a Monster. And this is what I want to end with. Nobody should have to entitle their TED Talk I Am Not a Monster, because we want to get to that point where none of us would believe that about another human being. Thanks so much for joining the discussion. Y'all called in lots of questions. You did a great job. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. And join us next week when we'll be talking about relearning how to get a good night's sleep. I talked to my guests. They weren't very good at it, so I hope they tune in next week. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.